A very good evening, Mr. Chairman of the Board, Mr. Ratzer. A warm welcome to our friends and guests from abroad, ladies and gentlemen, and many colleagues and familiar faces from the world of development. May I start with a warm congratulations and happy birthday on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of ÖFSE. And on this important anniversary, I would like to commend Mr. Ratzer and his entire team for the excellent research, for the high quality publications and programming, as well as critical analysis in the service of development cooperation for many, many years. 1967 must have been a very particular vintage. 50 years ago, another institution which stands for high quality programming and critical analysis, like ÖFSE, was founded, the Austrian Radio Broadcasting Ö1. What a fitting contemporary. I would also like to recognize the very valuable contributions made by Bishop Alois Wagner, an eminent personality who, through his huge commitment and dedication, made his strong mark on development cooperation in its early stages. And if I'm not mistaken, we're just above the room which is dedicated in Bishop Wagner's honor. Over the course of 50 years, ÖFSE has also built a leading library for development issues. It is free. It is frequently visited and greatly appreciated by students, by researchers, and the general public alike. And may I thank ÖFSE on behalf of all of them. 1967 is remembered as the summer of love, with the desire to make our world better, more peaceful, and more beautiful. ÖFSE, as well as the SDGs, have made an important contribution and will be making an important contribution to this end. May I now move to the topic that you've asked me to address this evening. It was the new Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who recently underlined the significance of the Agenda 2030 for the world community by calling it the boldest agenda for humanity. It is therefore important to recall that 193 heads of state and government adopted back in September 2015 this new agenda. The 17 SDGs and its 169 targets touch every aspect of our day-to-day life and are concerning every one of us. First and foremost, this agenda has taught us, and it was mentioned earlier by the chairman of the board, to redefine the term development. While its predecessors, the MDGs, were clearly aimed at improving lives in developing countries, the SDGs take a much more holistic approach to development. The Agenda 2030 looks at the world as one and tasks us with a domestic as well as an international responsibility. We have to admit that so far we've not really been able to get that message across sufficiently. This being the case, despite the bottom-up approach that was taken by the United Nations at the time of the creation of the SDGs. And I still remember the My World campaign initiative involving several million young people around the world who laid out their vision for the future. I equally recall the deep involvement of civil society representatives, many of whom are represented here today, the academic world as well as the business community in the creation of the Agenda 2030. And also the close cooperation with many of you in determining the Austrian position, which eventually was fed into a European position on SDGs. The SDGs are part of all our lives. We are in this together. It takes each and every one of us, institutions as well as individuals, to put them in practice. We've been listening carefully to many of your comments, to many of your concerns and questions over the course of the last month. And I will try to address some of those concerns, both at the development level as well as the national level. As you know, the Council of Ministers decided back on January 12, 2016, based on a national stock-taking exercise, in favor of a mainstreaming approach, looking at national policy frameworks through an SDG lens. I am aware that this mainstreaming approach found many critics among some of you here today, even though the European Union too has chosen this approach, as have a number of EU member states. We believe that mainstreaming is an important aspect to maximize ownership. The task that was given to the working group on SDG implementation, which is jointly chaired by the Federal Chancellery and the Foreign Ministry, was therefore to coordinate national implementation and reporting, both nationally and internationally. We were tasked to seek close cooperation with well-established stakeholder advisory groups in the spirit of mainstreaming the SDGs in the respective national policy framework. As you know, the set of indicators that will help us to measure our progress has not as yet been finalized by the United Nations. The Austrian Bureau of Statistics is working actively to identify how and from where to obtain the necessary data and how to make the system operational. The Federal Supreme Court of Auditors, der Rechnungshof, plans to apply the SDGs, including their targets and indicators, as an integral part of their audit criteria, both in Austria and through INTOSAI, the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, also in our partner countries. In order to better highlight the SDG relevance to a bill submitted to Parliament, our efforts on creating a reference to the relevant SDGs in the cover note of the respective bill are ongoing. As to the involvement of experts from the world of science, as suggested by some of you, we are currently working on a scientific advisory group who could support the work of the Ministerial Working Group. As to the overall efforts, the most recent SDG Index by the Bertelsmann Stiftung, and many of you may have seen it, puts Austria in 7th place out of 157 countries. Among the areas of good performance, this report lists ending poverty and hunger, providing access to water, renewable energy, as well as security and safety. Where we still need stronger efforts is, for example, responsible consumption and production, as well as climate action. This means that we are faced with a work in progress, that we do not need to hide our efforts so far, and at the same time still have our work cut out for the years to come. Austria's efforts on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda in development cooperation will strongly manifest itself in our new strategy 2019-21, which is currently being developed jointly by many of us here in this room. The future structure, as well as the substantive part of this 3-year program, will both be guided entirely by the SDGs. In the spirit of a whole-of-government approach, we are currently identifying which ministry will be in charge of the implementation of which SDG and by applying which instrument in our partner countries. When it comes to our work in our partner countries, we are closely coordinating with them and EU member states on the ground. This approach has been laid down in the new European Consensus on Development as presented by the High Representative Ms. Mogherini. This consensus tasks us, the European Union and its member states, to bring alive the Agenda 2030 in our development efforts around the world through a strengthening of our joint programming. I'm happy to be able to report to you that the Austrian Development Agency has already reformed its entire working structure based on temporary SDG indicators, which should help to measure progress on their project implementation efforts. Furthermore, in preempting the future strategy of development cooperation, ADA has also redirected all its projects towards the Sustainable Development Goals. As to budgetary concerns in development cooperation, we are hopeful that the incoming government will reconfirm the commitment to the step-by-step doubling of our bilateral programmable aid by 2021. This is to show our commitment to the Agenda 2030 in the field of development cooperation. Let me mention a couple of words on 2030 Agenda in Europe and 2030 Agenda at the United Nations. I already mentioned the new European Consensus in Development. It applies for the first time in its entirety to all EU institutions and all member states who commit to work closely together. It aligns European development action with the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, fully integrating the economic, the social, and the environmental dimensions of sustainable development. Currently, SDG implementation at EU level is being discussed in the so-called Jumbo Group, which brings together members from 3 different working groups at EU level that are all focusing on aspects of external relations. And therefore we are pushing at the moment very hard, together with other member states, for the establishment of a dedicated so-called Friends of the Presidency working group to work on SDG implementation on a more holistic level. This, I gather, will be a similar challenge to national parliaments, as they will have to decide which committee will deal with SDG implementation, a matter that is horizontal in nature and needs to be mainstreamed into all policies and strategies. At the UN level, as I've already mentioned earlier on, the new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in July of this year, termed the Agenda 2030 the boldest agenda for humanity, an agenda which he felt requires equally bold changes in the United Nations development system. And I quote, "We need to change in order to secure the promise of sustainable development, of human rights and peace for our grandchildren, and we have no time to lose." He put the new Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, in charge of this extensive reform process of the entire UN development system. And to be able to measure progress on SDG implementation, he instructed the so-called interagency and expert group on SDG indicators to speed up its work on the global indicator framework. Let me refer for a moment to the issue of communicating the Agenda 2030. I remember during my years in New York between 2012 and 2014, we were struggling with the term SDG, and I gather we are still struggling with that term. And that may not then surprise us that surveys today show that between 28 and 45% of people have heard of the SDGs, whereas just over 1 in 10 Europeans actually knows what the SDGs really mean and are. This means the SDG awareness not necessarily translates into knowledge, and we still have a lot to do. To improve on those findings, an SDG media zone was set up at UN headquarters in New York recently, with live interviews, with panel discussions and other digital content. In Austria, a dedicated website and internet portal serves as a platform for information exchange, www.sdg.gv.at. And as I was leaving the office for this event, I was being told that it is increasingly being filled up with content and upcoming events dedicated to the Agenda 2030. A special 2030 Agenda toolkit has been prepared for teachers and students of secondary schools. Discussions on SDG implementation were held at this year's European Forum Alpbach, bringing together eminent persons from government, from business, from civil society and academia. Workshops for NGOs on implications of the SDGs for Austria in their specific field of action are being organized by different Austrian ministries. Academic institutions, civil society and Austrian provinces have a fundamental role to play in disseminating the 2030 agenda at the state and municipal level, just as they contributed to the post-2015 process. They can again contribute to the SDG implementation. And the co-chairs of the SDG working group will have an interaction with representatives of the 9 Austrian provinces in the very near future. I may also raise the social entrepreneurship challenge, an initiative by the Austrian Development Agency honoring innovative concepts for socially sustainable business projects in developing and middle-income countries. And also would like to recognize the C3 Awards organized by ÖFSE and other non-governmental organizations as an important contribution to SDG implementation. The success of the 2030 agenda also largely depends on the active participation of the private sector. We need to look even closer at entrepreneurs as essential drivers of the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Many Austrian companies have already joined the Global Compact Austria chapter and are actively advocating the SDGs, both as a sound basis for socially responsible as well as economically successful action. Finally, we will not achieve the SDGs on our own. Global and national partnerships are an important prerequisite for progress in the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And I would therefore, while ending, call on all of you, all of us, to join hands and let us continue to work together and jointly bring alive this boldest agenda for humanity. Thank you very much, and another happy birthday to ÖFSE. Thank you.